Okay. Are we recording?
Yep, we're all set.
Okay. It's my pleasure to introduce Matt Carson. Matt is a freelance developer who builds apps with Angular, Node.js, and Firebase. He is a recovering .NET programmer who has fully embraced the JavaScript ecosystem. He has been using JavaScript and Angular since the AngularJS days. Matt resides near Indianapolis, Indiana, with his wife and 3 kids. In his free time, he enjoys woodworking, tinkering with electronics and CAD, playing VR, and enjoying time with his family. He's going to be talking about Angular elements today. So take it away, Matt.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, like Julie said, today we're going to be talking about Angular elements, and we'll get started. So the agenda tonight, is what is an Angular element, and then we'll go through a basic Angular elements demo. We'll see how to use multiple Angular elements. We'll talk about slots. And then we'll see how you can build, combine, and deploy your app locally or your web component locally. And then also how to deploy to the cloud, in this case with Firebase.
Were you going to share, Matt?
Oh, that would be easier, huh? How's that? Good?
Yep, thank you.
Okay, yeah, so there's the agenda. And we will start with what is an Angular element? And really an Angular element is kind of the same thing as a web component. And a web component is a set of web platform APIs that allow you to create new custom, reusable, encapsulated HTML tags to use in the web page or use in web pages and web apps. So really, Angular elements are just web components that were created with Angular and that originated as Angular components. So you can create an Angular component and package it as a web component and then give it to anyone, even if they've never used Angular before. They can put it in their React app, their Vue app, even an AngularJS app. And it's as simple as just sending them like a source JavaScript file and then an element to use. So an example of where you might use an Angular element or a web component is if you're a large company and you might have 3 different teams. One team might use React, one might use Vue, one might use Angular or AngularJS, and you might want to standardize on some sort of a component like a date picker, an autocomplete, and you don't want to have to always be updating 3 different one in series. You kind of want to have one source of truth component to use. This is a good use case for a web component because you can make it once, and then you can have all your different teams consume that same web component, and you always know that they're all going to be consistent. Another example of where you might use web components or Angular elements is coupled with a backend microservice. So a lot of teams are using microservices on the backend, but web components kind of give you a way to pair that to a small micro front end kind of, and then you can kind of couple those together and then use them as like a full stack micro building block. So you might have a company that has maybe it's like a hotel and they want to have reservations. You could have a web component that might search open reservations and then pair that with a microservice on the back end that just sends those a specific set of data to that web component. And you could kind of, like I said, use those as building blocks. And then the third use case, they can really just be used on any kind of a static HTML site. So one thing I did when I first started out was I did some work for a company that had a WordPress app, and they wanted like a calculator that was kind of involved. And instead of creating like a WordPress plugin and having to remember how to use PHP again, I thought web components would be, or Angular elements would be a good way to try that out. And it actually works pretty well. And they can just put that element in their WordPress HTML, then you don't have to worry about really anything else. Angular Elements natively supports Chrome, Edge, Firefox, Opera, and Safari. So most browsers. However, there isn't currently native support for Internet Explorer. If you do have a lot of clients using Internet Explorer, there are some polyfills that you can add in there, which would allow you to use Internet Explorer with web components. The only thing I've kind of found with Angular Elements is that certain browsers don't work quite as well with some of the change detection. So I kind of try to avoid using the automatic change detection from like Zone.js. And personally, I try to use like observables to like a on push method in the components. But even just manually running change detection seems to have better outcomes for if you have lots of different browsers. So next we'll kind of go through what's involved in creating an Angular element. And you really would start an Angular element project just like you would any other project in Angular. You'd run the ng new command and create a new project. And then you'll bring in Angular elements with the ng add command. And then you'll create a component that you'll want to eventually turn into an Angular element or a web component. After that, you're going to modify the module. This will be either your like app module usually, or it could even be your feature module. And we're going, if you want to use the Angular elements inside the same Angular app, which sometimes you might, you'll want to add the custom element schema to your schemas. And basically that tells Angular if they see an element that it doesn't recognize, like a div or a button element, not to worry that it's probably a custom element. And then you're actually going to remove the app component from the bootstrap, and you're going to manually add a manual bootstrap function. And then inside the function, you're going to create a custom element and then basically give it a name or a tag name to use. Lastly, when you actually build the component, you're really just going to build it like you normally would with Angular. There's nothing really special. The only nuance is that if you have an input name and you use like camel case or Pascal case, it's actually going to transform that to dashed lowercase. And just something you have to kind of keep in mind, because otherwise, like me, it might take you a day to figure out why none of your inputs are working. But outputs are not changed. So I'm going to go through here and basically code what I just talked about. So I've already created the app. So I'm going to add a new component. And it's just going to be a button component. Sorry. Okay, so I'm going to add a new button component. We'll just call it button. And that's going to be basically the web component that we're going to use. Then, like I said, we're going to add a schema. And that's going to be the custom element schema. And that's going to tell Angular not to worry about elements that it doesn't recognize. Next, we're going to remove that bootstrap where we bootstrap the app component. And we're going to add a constructor here in our app component. And we're going to bring in an injector. And then the injector really just allows us to use dependency injection if we have multiple apps and service or multiple components and services that we want to use together. And then the next thing we're going to do is call a function called ng-do-bootstrap. And what this does is just manually, since the bootstrap, since it's not going to bootstrap app component, this is where it's going to kind of start the app. And inside this function, there's 2 lines of code, and that's basically what's going to create the Angular element. So first, we're going to set a constant called element or L, and we're going to run the function called create custom element. And inside that, we just bring in that button component. And then we bring in a config object. And in this case, we're just going to assign the injector to the injector that we brought in to the constructor above. So that's what creates the custom element. And then all we have to do now is define a name for that. So in this case, I'll do ng-sd dash button. And then I'll assign that to that, or assign the element above to that name. So that's really kind of where the magic happens in creating the Angular element. Now in our app, we can use this ng-sd button anywhere in our Angular app. Of course, we haven't really created that component yet, so we'll do that now. Okay, so I'll just do a simple button here, but I want to show you how to use an input and an output as well. So I'll create that, and I'll call this button label, and it'll just be the label of the button. And it'll be a string, and I'll just call it default at first. And then I'm going to create an output that's going to be what the button will emit when you click it. And I'll just call this custom event. And this will be an event emitter. And we'll just set it to a new event emitter. And we'll bring in event emitter. So the only thing left to do now is I'm going to add a function called onClick that'll just emit something when the function's clicked on. So we'll do custom event.emit, and I'll just say emitting string. And then now we'll go back to the template file, and we'll just create a button here. And have the button labeled be that button label here. And then we'll add a click method called onClick. So really nothing we did in the last 5 minutes or so is really anything different than you would normally do in an Angular app. We're just building it out. So I'm going to serve this app here. And we're going to take out this app root since we're not really using it. And then I'm going to replace that with the NGSD button. So this is completely outside of Angular. And this, we're just using that custom element there, or the web component. Okay, so that button shows up and it's going to show default there because we haven't added an input yet. So outside of Angular, we have an Angular component that we're using without having, so we don't really need Angular at this point. So I'll just show you how to use that input, which I believe was button label equals. So then it changes to click me with the input. The next thing to do would be show how that output works. And for that, we're going to use a script file here. And what we're doing is getting the component and just adding an event listener on it. And it's that custom event, which is what we name the output. And we're just using the event to alert what we emitted in that component. So this is kind of the way you have to use any output on an Angular element. So now when we click this, it should, let's see. When we click it, it should give us that emitting string. So really at this point, we've kind of created the Angular element, and it can be used within the Angular app itself. And then I'll go over quickly how to use multiple Angular elements. So really it's no different. I'll kind of go over this quickly, but you're just going to generate and build however many components you want to do as you normally would. And then those same 2 lines of code we did in the app component, the app module, you're just going to do that again, however many times you need to. And then if I get to a point where I have like 5 or 6 different Angular elements in the same app, I'll just put them in a for loop, and then have an array of what you want to name the element and then the actual element. And then you run a for loop for those. Next, we'll talk about slots. So slots are basically just an HTML element that you can put inside of your Angular element, and it allows you to pass in markup to a web component. So it's kind of nice. You can use as many of these as you want. If you have different, you might have a title, or you might have an alternate paragraph that you want to add to your Angular element, and you don't have to, and you want it to go within a certain position inside of the Angular element. The one thing that you need, if you're going to use slots in Angular, you have to set the view encapsulation to shadow DOM. And then the steps to adding them are just adding a slot element in the Angular element where you want it to be, where you want the text to be projected. And then you'll give that slot a name attribute. And then you can also add default markup that gets replaced when you actually use that slot. And then consuming the slot and the web component, really you add a span element inside of your custom element, and you'll add the markup to that span element. So I'll show that quickly here. So inside the template folder, I'm just going to add a slot tag here, and we'll call this, or I'll just add default title here. And then I'll name this title. And that's really all that's involved there. And then when we want to consume that, or we want to use that slot, we will go back to our index file where we have this element, and I'll just add a span tag here. And inside there, I'll give a slot attribute that has the same name as the name we gave to the slot. And then you can do any markup you want here. I'll just do, this is the title. And the one thing I forgot to do was change the encapsulation here. And we have to set that to shadow DOM. And at that point, you get the title there. So if we took out this altogether, it would just have that default title markup with no H1 tag or anything like that. So again, that's basically the Angular element. If you want to use it inside of Angular, but if you want to use this Angular element outside of Angular, then you have to build the app, combine and deploy it locally or to the cloud before you can use it in other apps. So combining the files, it's not necessary, but it's going to make it a lot easier on developers that use the web components. Because in Angular, when you build an app, it's going to have 3 JavaScript files that are generated. So if someone uses your app, they would have to import 3 separate files, which would be kind of a pain. So we can do this with a simple Node script. Alternatively, there's a library called ngx build plus, and that gives you the ability to combine all the JavaScript files into one file during the build process. So that might be an easier route to use as well. But to build the element, you would build it like a normal Angular project. The only difference is you'll set the output hashing to none. And that just means that the files that output aren't going to have a long hash on the end of them. It's just going to be called like runtime.js. And then if you use the ngx build plus, you can just run ng build and then that single output will give you a single JavaScript file in your distribution folder. And then in this example, I'm going to use a program called HTTP server, and it's just going to run it, run this file. It's going to serve the file locally so we can try it out. So we'll go through that. And the first step, if you're going to use the node file to concatenate the files together, we're just going to create a new JavaScript file called concat.js. And this is the code for that node file. So really all that we're doing is we're setting a files array with these 3 files, which are going to be in the distribution folder once we build it. And it's going to combine all 3 of these together. And then make sure there's a folder called elements. If not, it will create it. And it'll move that single file called elements.js into the elements folder. And then it also is going to pull your style.css file into that same directory. In this example, we didn't really use any styles, but most apps you are going to have some sort of CSS there. So we'll save that, and to make it easier, I normally create another build script and just call it like build elements. So the command I use is ngbuild --prod, and then turn the output hashing to none. And then after that's done, we'll run the node concat.js file, and that's going to take the output from the distributions folder, combine it together, and put it into one folder, an elements folder. So we'll save that, and then I'll run that build script, and it should build the app. And then while I do that, or while this builds, I'm going to create a new index file completely outside of, like, in the root directory, and then we'll see how that works completely outside of Angular. Okay, so basically the same file that we used, or the same HTML markup we used before. And I'm going to run the HTTP server. So this is the address we're serving that file to, and we're just using the that file in the source, and then we're using this custom element that we use down here. And then we'll use the, so now we're kind of, it looks kind of the same, but what we're seeing now is that this file is now referencing a file outside of Angular, and we're still using an Angular component. So it's running, it's being served locally on this computer and being consumed in just a regular HTML file. And then the last thing I'll talk about is how to deploy this to the cloud. In this case, Firebase, but I'm sure Azure and AWS have very similar methods to do this as well. But we'll install the Firebase CLI globally or I guess you would have to do that. I've got it installed already, but it's a pretty simple command. And then you'll initialize the new Firebase project, and we'll just point to that elements folder when we initialize the project. And then we'll deploy to the Firebase. So to do that, we'll just run Firebase init. And we'll choose hosting because we want to host this single file. And here's where it's going to ask where we want our public directory to be, and that's going to be the elements folder. And we can say no to that. And then we just need to run Firebase deploy. And now it's going to basically put this Angular element in the cloud. And it's going to point to this address here. So I'm just going to replace the local, we're hosting it locally with the Firebase URL. And if that works, then when we refresh this, it should still have an Angular app there, which it looks like it does. So basically now, if even if any of you wanted to use that same link here in your own app, you could technically use this script file from Firebase and then use this ng-sd button, and it should work in any app that you build, Angular, Vue, React, or just an HTML file like we're doing here. So that's pretty much all I have for the presentation. There are a couple good resources that I learned a lot from that go a little deeper into it. The first one's a deep look at Angular elements by Manfred Steyer. And this is kind of a long video, but he talks a lot about polyfills and how to get around if you need to use this for Internet Explorer. And he also talks about the ngx plus build script I mentioned a couple times. Also, Advanced Angular Elements by Fireship or Jeff Delaney. There's a link here for that, but really, if you just search for those titles, both of those are really good videos to learn more about this. But again, that's all I have. Thanks for having me on. And if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. You can reach out on Twitter at Matt_Carson. And then the repo that I'm using here is on GitHub at this link above. So are there any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Do we have any questions for Matt?
If you have a question, feel free to either unmute and you can ask the question, or if or you can just put it in the chat and Julie or I can ask it for you. I'll wait for that. That was a fantastic talk, and your demo was just like spot on. That was so cool.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that kind of got me into it was, like I said, when I had to choose between, doing a project with PHP or being able to use Angular, which I'm very comfortable with, and RxJS, and it's just so much easier, I think, than if someone's asking you to build an app for them where you might not be as familiar with that language or that framework.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I would definitely, I mean, I have nothing against PHP. I just don't know it at all. So I would definitely rather write an Angular component than something PHP.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know, it's kind of probably the components I use make it a little boring because it's just a button, but you can use like child components, services, and you can really make them pretty complex with, even though the apps I'm just showing like a simple button, they can get pretty complex.
Yeah, for sure. And nice and customizable with the slots. Those are really cool.
Yeah.
Very, very cool. So no questions yet. Everyone seems, a lot of thank yous, a lot of people saying it was a great talk.
Yeah, I have a question.
But yeah.
Wait.
Oh
Can
yeah.
you hear me? This
Yes.
is James. So I'm kind of returning to Angular, and I remember somebody Frosty did a talk about this, or somebody did a talk. I saw it, but it's been a long time. Can you, like, why would I use an element when a component really ends up being an, I mean, is it an element at some point? But why would I need an element? What's the difference between an element and a component?
If you're going to be building an Angular app and everything's contained in that Angular app, then you really wouldn't want to use an Angular element. This would be more for like if you're wanting to build a component that can be consumed in a React app, Angular JS, a Vue app,
So it's just like a regular. It becomes a custom. It's a custom HTML element.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And there's different ways to build them. But if you're familiar with Angular, probably the Angular elements route is going to be the easiest way to create a web component. But there are other methods to do that. But in my experience, they're not, and maybe it's just because I'm more familiar with Angular, but Angular elements seems to have the best way to create these.
Okay. Yeah, great demo. That was cool.
Thanks. And then one other thing you can do is that we didn't show is pull in styling, and even in certain apps I've pulled in like Angular material. It does increase the size of the bundle, but if that's not something that's super critical, then I've done it, and it's not a huge app, but it's probably going to be, for something simple, it could be 400 or 500 kilobytes. But it's still nice to, if it's not super important, you just load these once, then it's nice to be able to use Angular material or whatever your style choice is.
You just mentioned sizing. I remember when the Angular elements first came out, one slight drawback was that they were like the distributed version was bigger than people were expecting. Is that still a pain point, or is that something that they've really gotten reduced now that we're at Angular 11?
It has gotten better, but it is going to be larger than if you just wrote this with obviously like vanilla JavaScript. So that's probably one of the main drawbacks. And then the other one being the change detection, but I'm not sure where that's going to go with Angular in general with the Zone.js. I don't know if it's going away, but it seems like it's not a bad idea to use like the on push in your components anyway. So it's probably not a bad habit to get into. But sometimes if you rely on that, the Zone.js, then when you're using in the browser, sometimes it doesn't work quite as you'd expect it to. So I'd say those are probably the two main drawbacks to using this.
Either of those are too bad. I always recommend everyone use on push anyway.
So. Right, yeah.
That fits in. All right, great. Any other questions for Matt? All right.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks
And
for
if you
joining
have
us.
questions later, feel free to message me on Twitter or reach out there.
Did Michi ask you already if we can have a copy of your slides?
I don't think so, but that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
That'd be awesome if you could provide those.
Sure. Yeah, I'll send them to you.
Okay, thanks.
And we're recording, so Matt's talk will also be available on YouTube for you to watch later. And if you're